Hello, my name is Elisabeth, and today I'll be taking you on a campus tour around the University of Portsmouth campus. So this first place you can see here is the University Library. It's open 24/7 and has a cafe inside that serves hot food and drinks. We have the academic writing services in here and the IT help desks inside. There are laptops you can borrow and group study rooms that you can book, as well as quiet study areas upstairs. Next we arrive at the northern quarter. This is Burnaby Terrace. And here we have Richmond Building, which is the School of Business. It has one of the largest lecture theatres inside and a simulation courtroom and interview rooms. Next up are Portland and the Future Technology Centre, which are the schools of technology and engineering. You can see the golden squares on the wall, which are the microbacteria that are being grown for research. Then we move on to Liongate Building, which hosts the new MyPort Hub, which is here to help you with accommodation, finance, student life and visa help. If we keep walking, we'll arrive to Buckingham Building, which is the School of Computing, followed by the Dennis Schema Building, the School of Astronomy, Astrophysics and Cosmology, which has a space simulator and hosts the Hub Cafe, which serves hot food. After that, we get to Burnaby Building, which is the School of Environment and Geosciences. The greenhouses at the back are used to grow plants for research. Next is Anglesey Building, which has a robotics lab and also a cafe. After this very long walk, we get to King Henry Building and St Michael's Buildings, which are the schools of psychology, biology, chemistry and medical sciences. And right after that is Park Building, which is the oldest building on campus, dating back to 1907. This is the School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Languages. It also has a cafe inside and one of the biggest lecture theatres. Next we arrive at our Careers and Employability Centre. The career services stay with you for up to 5 years after you graduate, and they can help you with CV help and interview help. They also offer free language courses. This is Eldon Building, which is a school of creative arts, architecture, photography and other subjects like this. There are very cool photo studios and video and movie recording studios. Then we get to ULC, which is the building that's used for exams mostly. There's no school directly linked to this building, but you'll probably go here quite often, so it's good to know where it is. Next is St Andrew's Court. This is the School of Health Sciences. It has a simulation hospital inside. We're now arriving to our Student Union. This has the Student Union shop, where you can buy all of your University of Portsmouth merch, your student wellbeing and advice services, as well as the Gunhouse Green, which is where the Freshers' Fair will be, the Terrace Cafe, which has great deals on lots of good food, Third Space and the Common Room, which are used for lots of society hangouts as well as lots of things during Freshers' Fair. Finally, we get to Ravelin, which is our gym, which has a swimming pool, a climbing wall, multi-sports halls and lots of classes you can join inside. There's also a cafe. I hope you enjoyed this tour and we're looking forward to seeing you at the Freshers' Fair very soon.